Well, back in the 80s and early 90s, there really wasn't any work at all in the Maritimes where I was. So Prince Edward Island, I tried for months and months just to find a minimum wage job and couldn't. So I left in my car, I think, with about $300 or $400 left, and drove across several times, going to get work and then going back. And eventually I just didn't go back except to visit. It just, there just wasn't. My life became more and more out west. And so now I just go back to visit.
You drove across the continent for a minimum wage job. Is that right?
Yes, several of them actually. It just, there weren't any jobs. You know, I would get jobs back in Prince Edward Island, like harvesting potatoes, and you'd be sitting in the back of a potato harvester. It would be pitch dark. There would be fumes coming up out of the tractor into the cab that you're working in. You know, you're trying to beat the frost, so it's, about 1 or 2 degrees, and you're in this clunkety thing going back and forth, and you're lucky to have that, but it's only going to be 2 or 3 weeks work, and then you're back where you started. So when fall started to come around, the last time I left, I think it was the middle of September, I say, okay, this is the cutoff. I can't leave it any longer. So I hopped in my car and drove out west, because after that, I figured I might hit snowstorms in northern Ontario or really bad weather. So I do love the East Coast, but over time, I've become more of a West Coast person, I guess.
What kind of work did you find out there initially?
Initially, jobs like working on farms in Alberta, and that was less than minimum wage. Then up into the Okanagan for a while, I was fruit picking, so that's in the mountains in the interior of the mountains in British Columbia, and that's also less than minimum wage. I worked in a sign shop for a while. I started out working for free and then gradually got paid a little bit. Worked in a couple of sign shops and a whole bunch of different things. It's been a long time. I'm in my mid-50s, so I'm kind of hesitating because I'm dredging into my memory here quite a way back.
That's your job, right?
Yes. Yeah.
To kind of dig into the past and pull some of these things out. And I know that at least with this project, you had the benefit of having some journals that you were pulling from.
Yes.
I've talked to a lot of people a lot of artists who have done some farming work or some harvesting work. A lot of times it's seasonal. They'll do it to augment the art that they create. And a lot of them actually tend to enjoy it. A lot of them tend to find it to be almost kind of a meditative process.
I would agree with that. Sometimes it's unpleasant or cold or you're in a situation where you're not being treated very well by the employers. Farm work can get like that sometimes, but you get into, after a few hours, you get into sort of a trance-like state. And sometimes you come up with ideas or poems or you get into a strange creative state of mind sometimes when you're doing labor like that. So yeah, I mean, I've done lots of other work, but that was my initial thing. So it's kind of good. It gives you a work ethic. So it might not seem like there's any transferable skills from it, but you can work hard at a project. You can tackle it. You can plow through difficult points. I would actually recommend it to everybody to do work like that when you're younger. I
don't know if this is the case with all of your jobs, but in a lot of these jobs on the farm, it entails waking up really early. For a lot of them, it's kind of the crack of dawn to get started. And certainly people who have not had prior work experiences and are just in the arts have a lot of difficulty keeping any sort of schedule.
Yes. Yes.
You sort of alluded to, I guess, mentally writing poems as you were involved in that process. Was that part of your early artistic ambition?
My early artistic ambition, I guess, was to be an artist of some kind. I used to go to the library and read books with, paintings like the Group of Seven and other Canadian artists and Impressionist art and other nice, colorful stuff. And I dabbled in painting, and then later on in life, I sold a few paintings. But there was a point around grade 6 or grade 8, I can't remember, where I thought about being a comic book artist. and started to write a comic which was based on kind of a copy between a comic called Papyrus, I think, and Lloyd Alexander's books, the non-comic books. I forget what the series was called, but one of the books was called Terran Wanderer, where at some point somebody's riding around on a giant cat. So I had limited creativity at that point in my life. So I sort of combined the costume from Papyrus with the riding a giant animal, which I switched to a dog. I thought that was terribly clever of me. But then at that point, things kind of changed in my life and didn't go that great. And there was this gigantic gap where I didn't do anything with comics at all. But there was one point where I thought about it. But growing up in rural Prince Edward Island, comic book artist was not an option. There was no art school. And I honestly, at that point, didn't think it was a career that women could even do, or girls could even.
There's a familiar story there. I think it's changed these days. You know, I think that comics beyond superheroes have broken through enough to the mainstream that people realize that there is a world outside of that. And along with that world comes potentially the ability to actually do that as a living. But I have spoken to so many artists over the years who read comics growing up and were familiar with superheroes and other books and didn't even realize that there was a possibility outside of that.
No, I had no idea at all. I didn't know graphic novels existed until 2017.
Was that a shock to your system?
No, it was more of a gradual realization because it took me a while to discover what I liked. You know, I had to read a whole stack of them before I realized there was a pattern to which ones I liked and which ones didn't interest me that much. So it wasn't like a eureka moment. It was like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, I like this one, but this one doesn't appeal to me. Oh, I want to get more of these and check into them. And then gradually I realized that I was really into mostly the memoir type of comics and the longer form, like ones that really appealed to me were Mimi Pond's The Customer's Always Wrong, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, those type of things were the ones that really appealed to me. But it was a gradual discovery.
I imagine that Fun Home in particular was a bit of a revelation in terms of the subject matter that you could potentially cover in a comic.
Yes. Personal, that one was a big influence in how I approached the book that I did, Our Little Secret. Partly because I liked the caption heavy part of it. I enjoyed that. And also I liked her line work, the ink work. And also because it talked about some very personal things. It talked about family, a lot of musings about the good and the bad in people. Yeah, that was a big influence, that one.
This was a story that you were holding in for a long time.
Yes.
At what point did you realize that was something that you wanted to share with the world? And did that predate the realization of the medium that you could use to express it?
It was sort of a convoluted path because it wasn't like I could say, I know of this person that has gone through this and they wrote a comic book and then everything was great. So there really wasn't anybody that I could copy out there that I could see at the time. So it was more a process of the lawsuit taking so long and weighing more and more on me. The feeling of having to contain the secret was just getting more and more unbearable. And I did try to write some poetry and creative nonfiction, and I found that told part of the story, but I felt like there was a lot of it that was still not told. And I came to realize that over time, that with comics and seeing that there was such a thing as autobiographical or memoir comics, I realized that I could show in detail what happened. And instead of describing it, instead of spending a whole page describing a scene in the forest and what the leaves look like, I could just draw it. And so I started on it as a class project, and then gradually it turned into a book. And with sharing it, I guess I hope that by sharing it, it might do some good, because I didn't see a lot out there that I could find with the detail that I put into my story.
You had said that you didn't have any examples of somebody who did something similar and then then everything was great, which obviously is, I think everybody would like a sense of catharsis in that work, or a sense that they've been able to sort of exercise some of those demons or some of those things that we've been carrying around and not sharing with people.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't go so far as assuming that everything is great now that this is out in the world, but how has it changed your own relationship with the subject matter?
It's interesting because I didn't have any really preconceived notions of what would happen. So I've been thinking about this because it's still settling in. The book's only been out for a short while, and I feel different. I feel fundamentally different, but it's a subtle feeling. I thought maybe it would feel like a giant burden being lifted off, but it's more subtle than that. It's some kind of feeling of freedom, but it's not like a giddy feeling of freedom. It's just like a feeling of relief. And somebody said something interesting the other day, which was that because I had now contained my story in a book, it was now physically separated from me. And I thought that was interesting because it sort of does feel like the story is physically separated from me. And so when I talk about it, it doesn't affect me in nearly the same way. It doesn't trigger me. It doesn't make me, unless you ask for, extreme detail about a certain scene, it probably wouldn't trigger any flashbacks type episodes or anything. And I feel quite separated from it, and the emotional part is gone. Sometimes I feel anger. Maybe that's an emotion that's still left in me that I haven't really expressed. But the fear and all that I felt before, all the other emotions seem to be gone, interestingly.
It's an interesting analogy. I to hear it described that way, it almost likened it to like a message in a bottle, of writing something down on a scroll and popping the cork on and then sending it off into the world.
It is. That's a neat way of putting it, yeah.
I don't know how far ahead you were thinking, and obviously, I get the sense that this has sort of taken on a life that certainly you wouldn't have expected when you first started taking those classes. Were you anticipating the potential difficulty in, once you had left that message in the bottle out, of having to kind of relive this in subsequent conversations and the book tour, and having to speak to people about the subject matter?
I hadn't honestly thought about it. It's because it felt like it was something I had to do. So I didn't really, it was something that I felt I couldn't contain anymore. So I couldn't live with it being contained inside me anymore. It was this feeling of constantly either being crushed or ready to burst. I don't know which the best way of putting it is, but so no, I didn't really put a whole lot of thought into what what I was going to do after, because it was just something that was necessary to do. I suppose it's a bit like if you see your house is on fire, you don't really think about when you're going to call the insurance company and what you're going to tell them. You just want to put the fire out. And it's all you think about is the how you're going to get the fire out. I mean, I guess that's kind of not a great analogy, but at the time of writing it, I was so deeply into whatever part of my brain the story was in, that it was a matter of getting the story out, and once it was out, I would live with it. I do remember saying to myself, whatever happens, I can live with it, because I know I can't live with the story trapped inside me. So whatever happens after it's out, I will live with it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the lawsuit is a big part of the book, just in the amount of time that it took and the years, or I don't know, even like decades that it took to go through that process. Surprising isn't the right word, but it's interesting to hear that it was that process that really triggered the creation of the book versus the sort of the initial trauma that you went through. What's your sense of why that was what made you feel like you needed to get this story out?
So it was 2010 when I first when I saw Richard again, and the abuse had happened in the 80s. So that was a big span of time and that was when I realized how it had affected me. That's when it all came kind of rushing back. So getting involved in the lawsuit in a way meant that I was silenced until the lawsuit was over. And what I was trying to do, my goal was to get the story out. So I would sometimes I'd mention to my lawyer, I'd like to put something in the press or the paper. And he'd say things like, well, you might, usually the press is sympathetic, but, it could backfire, and you can't contact Richard. That would be terrible. And you can't do this and you can't do that. So the legal process itself was silencing me. And that was part of the frustration once I got into that process, I had to sort of go along with what my lawyer was saying, which is to stay quiet about it until the whole thing was over. And it was not so much the lawsuit, although that was crazy making for sure, but it was the being silenced for such a long period of time after being told to keep something secret. And what you want to do more than anything is to not keep it secret.
If you had been afforded that ability, and if you had been able to sort of go to the press with it, I mean, obviously the process of, talking to a reporter and watching that see print versus, sitting down and working on this book and being able to tell your own story from beginning to end. What's your sense of what the story you would have wanted to tell at the time would have been?
At the time, it was more of an emotional reaction. When I wrote the story, I wasn't angry. I was just looking into the story. But at the time that I was going through the lawsuit, I was really angry. So I did try to get the story put in the press a little bit, in the sense that I was longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize a few years ago, and the poem was about the sexual abuse as well. And so I thought, okay, here's my chance to put something in the paper. So I went to the paper and said, the local paper, and said, I've written this poem. I was wondering if you could. They wanted to do an article, but what was interesting is that they refused to mention his name. Their lawyers were too frightened to mention his name. So in a way, I was being silenced again. So you can talk about your poem, but you can't talk about who did it to you, and what happened. So there were other ways I could have. There's the internet. There are many other ways that I could have made it public. But the reason in the end that I wrote the book is because I thought of all of the things that I could have done. The book has the best chance to help other people.
I thankfully haven't been through something similar, but it was, when you say anger, it was a desire to make this person pay for what he'd done?
Accountability. I guess I wanted some kind of a public admission or acknowledgement. Some kind of... I also wanted to know if he had abused anybody else. At the time that it happened, he seemed to be kind of it seemed too easy for him. I thought even at the time, I remember thinking, anybody who does this and it seems so easy, surely they've done this before.
It seemed like it wasn't his first time doing that.
That was my impression. It seemed to me like he had some lines that he liked to use, and maybe he'd used them before. And I think that I was hoping that if it went to a trial or something like that, then people would maybe somebody would show up and say, hey, this guy did this to me too. But it's just that the odds are pretty good. There are very few people who molest just one underage person. There are some, but the odds are that he's done it more than once.
It sounds like the process for you was really sitting down and almost working through it on paper. And I find this differs quite a bit from artist to artist. There are certainly those people out there who like to map out every bit of the story and have the entire book essentially written before they sit down. But I got the feeling it wasn't quite stream of consciousness, but that you were really almost working through the book in real time as you were drawing it.
That is pretty much exactly what happened. Is when I went to start the book, it's almost like, and I don't really know how these processes work, I'm just taking my best guess, is...
It was literally your first time even trying this.
Yes. So it's almost like I had a wall that I'd shoved all this stuff behind so I could function in my life, just compartmentalizing. And then I said, okay, I'm going to sit down with a stack of paper and a pencil, and I'm going to start writing. And I took that approach after listening to a podcast, actually interviewing Seth. And he talked about his approach to memory. and how it's not necessarily linear. You can just go and you can remember one thing and it might trigger another thing, and then you wander through that. So I sat down with my stack of paper and I imagined, I guess, opening up this wall or some hole in the wall so that the story could come out. And I wrote down the first thing that came into my head. And the first thing that came into my head was, when I look back, what really stands out is the flies. And this picture came into my head of a giant fly. And I think I mentioned before to somebody once, it wasn't like a giant fly. It was just that I was really close up and it was sitting on the counter. And my dad's log cabin was in the background. So I drew that, and then I just kept going with the next image and the next image. And when I went to edit it, there were suggestions like make this panel bigger, or you have too many panels, or you could shorten this up, or this is repetitive. But the basic structure, once I'd gone through the whole thing, didn't change.
Why was the fly? How did that end up being the right place to start things?
I don't know. It's the first the words came into my mind and then the image. So I didn't know why, but I just went with it and I just followed it through there. I really liked the fly. It gives a tone to the whole story. Flies like old rotten things. They're gross. They lay eggs and maggots come out and crawl over the place. I mean, nobody really likes flies. So it's sort of, for me, gave a tone to the story. Whatever, the fly is there, and then you go into the story. And this sort of image, I guess, in your mind of the fly maybe stays a little more. So there was a bit of discussion as to whether it was a good idea to start a book with a giant fly in it. But and they went back and forth. The Drawn and Quarterly for a while didn't think it was a great idea, and then they changed their minds, and we went with the fly, which was the original image.
What was the pushback initially? Just that it's sort of unpleasant to open on this big insect?
Exactly. The thought was that people might pick up the book and see the giant fly and, not really want to go any further.
This is something that I largely encounter when I talk to either poets or musicians, but writing a poem or a song lyric and then only really realizing the symbolism or really what you were writing about after you're done or after you're removed from it. And there's something, I think probably what we should highlight a little bit for those who haven't read it is the flies were not only really pervasive for a portion of your childhood, but the reason why they were around is because there were these giant cracks in your father's log cabin, and they were really just like, I don't want to put too fine a point on it or drill down on the metaphor too much, but just having the literal seams of your home crawling with these flies. I mean, that's the imagery kind of speaks for itself.
Yes. And if I had sat down and come up with a plot and written out an outline of the story, never in a million years would I have said, page 1, draw a giant fly, page 2, keep going with the flies, describe where the flies are, they're buzzing everywhere, why they're there, have father stomping in circles, ranting and raving and looking for his glasses. It never would have come out like that. And whatever the place is where these stories sit in your head, this was the first time I found that place. And I wonder if everybody has a place where there are stories like this, that if you just can find it, that these stories come out. But I know now that I can access it. I don't know if I can make something as good again, but I know that I can find that place again, and I can write other books from that same place, which is really a neat thing to discover. And I feel like I want to sit down and draw a whole bunch of books and do a whole bunch of books. And, but I sort of discovered this place in my head where the stories come from and never could access it.
I think we're risking kind of speaking in too much abstraction here. I'm kind of thinking of it in sort of the process of meditation where you can kind of try to meditate every day and bang your head against the wall, and then one day it sort of clicks, and then once you get that feeling, it's possible to go back there again.
That makes sense. Yeah, maybe something like that. I don't really know what it is.
What does place mean insofar as you're actually able to kind of articulate such an abstract idea?
It's I don't really know where it is in my head or what it means, but I know that if I get a stack of paper and a pencil and I don't have to worry about, too much of the day-to-day things, if things are moderately organized in my life and I'm in a nice, comfortable place and it's pretty quiet, I can sit down and given a little bit of time, I can get into that place and produce reams and reams of stuff, which may or may not be any good in the end, but the volume is certainly there. So, and then you sift through it, I guess, to find something that might be useful.
Is it accessing memory? Is it writing a memoir? Or is it really just being able to be productive?
It means I can sit down and create. So it could be a very different topic. For instance, I'm working on a book, hopefully a book, about conversations with a friend of mine who goes to Mexico every winter and surfs. He's a very interesting character. So that's more based on our conversation. So it's much less much less of that involved. But I have other ideas. I thought it might be interesting to write a story about animals or even chickens, which I've had, and that would involve the same type of thing. It would be just going to a place where I'm thinking about the topic, and I go with whatever images or memories or thoughts. It could be something from the past or the present. It could be musing on the future of chickens. What are chickens going to be like in 1,000 years? It could go in any direction, but I know that if I sit down, I can get to something anyway.
It's one of those things that seems really obvious on the face of it, but is much more difficult when you sort of sit down and try to make a thing, is especially this thing that's been weighing on you for a number of years, and that is a long story that does take up multiple decades in your life, is it's impossible to know exactly where to start. So it sounds like the thing that you've been able to identify is that you just need to find a good starting place and just let the story kind of build out from there, whatever form it ultimately takes.
Yeah. I think that's probably what happened, is that I just found a starting point. I think maybe if you keep something bottled up like that for such a long time, you can't bring the whole wall down at once or it crushes you. So you let a little bit out and then you follow that. I had no idea really where it was going to go, but I just took once that thread started, it seemed to carry on its own, really, which was nice because I don't know how I would have approached it. I guess maybe I would have gone in some kind of chronological order otherwise, but it would have been a completely different book. Completely different.
There is a chronology there to a certain extent. There is a way in which, it does go through a period of your life. But I think more than that, and I'm kind of curious how much of this is really because it was your first book and because you did quite literally learn how to write a book and learn how to be a cartoonist in the process of actually creating it, that at a certain point, it becomes a meditation on the act of writing a book.
Yes. It does. It almost becomes, I don't know if it's a meditation. It could be, or it could be almost an out-of-body experience where you're sort of observing yourself writing a book, but you don't really have any real part in it. It's like the process happens automatically and you're sort of the observer. I don't know which, I haven't really thought about, so I don't know which would be more accurate, but it seemed to be a process that was happening on its own.
Pragmatically, from the standpoint of there are points where it's almost like a meta commentary, right? There are points when you're actually talking about what it's like to write a book, and you're sort of talking about, as you're going through it, you're figuring out that you can break the rules, or you're figuring out that, that limitations in the process of storytelling are self-imposed.
Yes, I think that was because, as you mentioned earlier, I was going through, the story was me working all this out in my own mind as well as writing a story. So I would hit walls. I'd go into dead ends. And when I got to those points, sometimes I would draw back out of the story itself and come back to the present moment and wonder how I was going to deal with this or what was happening, or think about future readers, and then maybe go back into the story. And sometimes metaphorical images would come in too. So I think there were several layers. There was the present moment, there was remembering the past, and then there was sort of this almost a dream world or some kind of metaphorical place where images weren't images that were real, but they had meaning to the story. So I think I wandered in and out of those areas as I just, it was almost like a maze, I think, that I wandered through until I finally got to the end.
And I think a central piece of imagery, or maybe even the central piece of imagery beyond the flies that we discussed earlier, is encountering, in this very dreamlike state, encountering a girl who is you to a certain extent, but that is quite literally a kind of a dream state. Is that an instance? I mean, is that based on a dream you had, or is that really just purely from the process of writing through the book?
A little bit of both. So I think what you're talking about is the prairie landscape that appeared, and that image first came to me during the daytime, and I go through this in the book. It came to me in the daytime, and I thought I was hallucinating. So I was having some kind of a panic attack. I don't know what was going on, and I ended up running out of the house, taking off because it felt like a panic attack or something. But the part of the image was the landscape, and me as a young kind of sun-deprived waif-like girl on this landscape. And nothing like that had ever happened to me before, or since, for that matter. And so the image stuck in my mind, and it came back as I was going through the book, kind of wandering through these different states of either remembering or coming into the present moment or going into this sort of metaphorical land. It just came back. It came back as I was writing it. There was a point in the book where I write, and then everything went white. And those were the words that came into my head, and then everything went right. So I wrote those words down. And then the next image was the whiteness gradually disappearing, almost like a receding fog. And then I was back in this landscape again, this undulating prairie landscape that had just covered with dead brown grass and a white sky. And then the girl was there again, and she started to talk to me. So, and this wasn't a hallucination or anything. It just happened as I wrote. The dialogue came into my head, and she would say things, and I would say things, and I would write them down. I just allowed it to happen. It was interesting, to say the least, to go through it.
Well, certainly that first instance that you're talking about, when you first encountered that, I mean, hallucination is probably the word that I would have gone to. It sounds like it felt real the first time.
It did. It felt real. It felt absolutely 100% real. I could feel the cold. I could feel the cold air. I could see the grass waving. I could see the white sky. Yeah, I mean, it felt completely 100% real.
Looking back on that and with some distance from it now, you know, and I assume that you've talked to people about it. Obviously, it's in the book, and
yeah,
imagine that on top of sort of these sorts of conversations, you probably have talked to the people in your life about it. But are you able to explain what happened there?
I was in counseling at the time, so the first thing I did was talk to my counselor about it. I wanted to make sure I'd heard the phrase psychotic break, and I'm wondering if this is a psychotic break. This seems to be a bad thing. But he always just minimized everything. It was his way of just, he never made a big deal. He said, "Oh, those are just daydreams." So it didn't feel like that to me. It felt like something frightening and real and panicky. But and I said to him, what if this happens when I'm at work? And he says, "Oh, no, don't worry, it's not going to." So I was skeptical, but he was right, it didn't. So do I have any explanation? No, not really. I suppose of all the imagery, the prairie is the one that I'm still thinking about where is it and what does it mean? What is this place? And I Google it, and there's 25 different opposing explanations for it. So that doesn't go anywhere. But it's one thing I wonder is I used to do quite a lot of painting of horses and work horses usually, and I sold a few of them. And I'm just looking over at the painting, which is why the same landscape is there. So it's a brown, undulating prairie landscape with a white sky. So what I'm theorizing is that place was always there, and I was trying to paint pictures out of it. So this image would appear in my paintings. And it was something I wasn't aware of. I just thought, I really like how the white sky and the prairie looks together. I think I'll do another one. But maybe there was some other connection.
Is it like any landscape that you encountered in your childhood?
Nope. I suppose when I worked out in Alberta on the farms, it was similar. I worked on a farm in a place called Lethbridge, which it was a pretty stark landscape, and hobbies would include looking out the window and watching the tumbleweed gather on the fence, that type of thing. It was a pretty stark landscape, but that's when I think of the painting, that's not the landscape that I'm thinking of. But it's the only one that I've been in that looks similar. It's not a real landscape. It's a dream. It's not a place. Yeah, it's a dream. It's not a place.
It's kind of refreshing to hear you say that your counselor minimized things, because it's. I think people tend to sort of, you want somebody in that position to be as honest as possible, but also you don't want them to make you too concerned about something like that. Do you find that sort of approach, that kind of very kind of honest, but I guess not too hyperbolic approach is useful in practice?
Well, I talked to a few counselors, and he was the mysterious of them all. I'd sometimes ask him, what the heck's wrong with me? And he would say things like, why can't you just relax and go through the process? He would never really come out with this long list of issues. So that was just his style. Now, whether or not that's the best thing or not, I don't know. But it turned out to be the most effective for me because it left me puzzling. And wondering, what does this mean? What's going on? So he would be a little bit vague about things and would leave me going home to try to struggle through and figure it out. And I think that kept it in my mind longer, and it etched it in my mind a lot longer than if somebody had said, oh, well, here's your list of deficits and we're going to go through them one by one and fix them. So it was a style, I don't know what you'd call it, but it was effective for me.
Well, certainly effective for the creative process, right? And that you really had to kind of grapple through that yourself.
It's true. It was a solitary path for sure.
Speaking with him, or speaking with any of the counselors that you went to, what were their thoughts on this project?
I didn't talk. The counseling that I had was all before this project. At the start of this project, I recognized that it was going to be difficult. I was going to go into dark places that I'd never been to before. I didn't know how I was going to cope with that. It's something that I'd walled off for literally decades. And I was going to dig into it deeper than I ever had, and I wasn't sure how to cope. So I did try to find a counselor to help me to go through the process. And I said to him, I'm writing this book. I think it's going to be difficult. I need someone that I can check in with every so often and make sure I'm not, losing my mind, literally. So I saw him for maybe five or six sessions when he suddenly switched gears and said that he wanted me to go into a group therapy and that I should stop writing the book. And I struggled with this. I don't want to go into group therapy. I definitely don't. I do not want to do this. I'd like to write the book. And he pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally I just cracked and I left. I literally almost fell as I was walking home. I was shaking. And I never went back, of course, because I knew this was a book that I had to write. But at that point, I'd spent probably $700 given to him. And I felt really, really betrayed and shaken at that point. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to go and start this over with somebody else after that. And I'd already started the process at this point. I couldn't stop it. And I just said, I'm going to go through this on my own, and whatever happens, happens. So at that point, I just went in on my own. And I guess there's maybe something that protects you hopefully when you go on a voyage like that only reveals things to you at a pace that you can handle it. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe this isn't something that you should do without counseling, but the fact that I had to go in on my own, again, made it a different book than it would have been if the counselor had stuck with me and if I'd stuck with him.
How so?
I don't imagine I would have. Basically, this was a journey I went on my own, and kind of, like I said, like a maze that I went in. I might not have entered that state, or maybe it would have been different. Maybe he would have tried to explain what it meant, pulled me out of it. But going in it and working out it on my own, the imagery that came to me, like bears and wolves and flies and Lady Justice appeared, like all of a sudden on one page, and I had to deal with that. Like, what am I going to do with this character? Where does she fit in? So maybe none of those things would have happened if I'd had somebody, in a way, holding my hand through the process.
In a way, there was a power in not knowing what these images meant.
Yes. There was a risk to doing it by myself, but doing it by myself allowed all of these images to be whatever they wanted to be without somebody telling me what they meant. I think it gave the characters in the story a life of their own. They had autonomy in a way.
What was his rationale for telling you that you needed to stop?
I'm not sure. I would like to think that he was doing it for my own good and trying to protect me in some way, because that's what you want to believe your counselors are doing. But I think there's another possibility, is that it was deeper than he knew how to deal with. He was mainly a guy who dealt with people in group situations. That was his other thing. And I think he thought it was maybe an easier path. I'll never know. I never went back. I was too shaken up. I was literally physically almost unable to walk when I left the office. I was so shaken.
As you said, that the plane, for example, is something, or the prairie, sorry, for example, is something that that has been a reoccurring motif through a lot of the work that you've done. With something like that in particular, is there a sense that, like, have you exercised that, or do you think that it's something that could find its way back into your work again?
I'm not sure. I think it might, particular to this story. I sort of hypothesized that it was a place that was, shoved behind the wall, so to speak, and I would just catch glimpses of it or ideas of it. I haven't had any images of the prairie come back since then, and I haven't had any urge to do any paintings with that landscape in it recently. I won't know, and here's the catch, though, is I won't know until I actually sit down and do the process, because if I follow the kind of the way I did this book, I'll go into the story, whatever story I'm working on, and it could pop up with no notice. I'm interested to see if it comes back. I don't think it will, but if it does, I'll explore it again.
As you said, this isn't something that you will know until you work at that, or even if you ever really know it or figure it out at all. And it sounds like that specific image, and certainly that the girl, that version of yourself, are really tied to this very specific trauma that you were dealing with in this book.
It feels like it. I think at one point in the story, I write that I'm thinking about the girl on the prairie that is me. I've recognized that it is me, and saying something along the lines of, "Did Richard put her there?" And then replying to my own question, I feel like he did. So am I sure that that's what happened? No, I'm not sure. And I've been as careful as I can in the story not to attribute anything to Richard that I'm not sure about. The dialogue in the book comes from my diaries, word for word. So it's not, I don't remember what he said. I'm transcribing it directly from my diary from the time.
Are there any other instances of reoccurring motifs in your work that surfaced again in this book?
Not that I know of. No, not really. The prairie, I think, is the one that baffles me the most, and it seems, because the other ones kind of make sense, in a lot of ways. The other ones are simpler, but this is a location, not just an animal or a fly. It's a location. It's a place. I don't really know where the place is, but no, I don't think anything else like that did pop up. Nope. I'm just thinking, because I haven't thought about it before. I can't think of any other instance right now.
As you said earlier, the book is still fairly new, but now that it is out in the world, what have the reactions been like, the people in your life who've read it?
It's been, I've only had a few people in my life read it. One of the reasons is I wanted the book to be out into the world in the form of a book and in stores before I talked too much about it. There's always the fear that abused children have, and I don't think it's just me. I think this is very common, and that is that the feeling that the abuser is the most powerful person in the world, and that they can somehow reach you wherever you are, even after all this time. So I had the fear that if the book got out there before it was turned into a book, that somehow he would be able to get me and stop me from telling the story. That fear stayed with me right up until the box of books basically arrived in my living room. Now, so very few people have seen it. The few people that have seen it, I've felt good, because what I was trying to say, that's what they seem to get out of the story. So there's been a bit of, some people have said things like that they're sorry they didn't realize I'd had such a hard time, which was nice, because I didn't run up to people in my life and tell them this whole story. But when they read the book, they didn't realize, because I'd been kind of compartmentalizing it all. And I shared it with one other victim of sexual abuse, and her reaction was pure anger. She said she was angry I didn't get justice. She was angry about what happened to her. Anger. Now, anger is not really what I'm trying to get, but I'm trying to inform people, and I'm trying to tell a story that's hopefully interesting. But I'm trying to inform people. These are the stages. These are the steps of the abuse. This is what it looks like, and this is how absolutely ridiculous, these people are. The ridiculous things they say to try to convince children to go along with what they want to do. When this lady that read the book was angry, I thought, man, that's really not what I'm going for. But I think it's unavoidable. I think if you see something like this and you've been through it, you have to go through anger. So I don't think I can make a book that just is informative and a nice story. I can't do that. It doesn't work. This story, because of the story that it is, will make a lot of people who have been through this angry, and hopefully they'll work through that and come to terms with it, come to terms with whatever happened to them, and hopefully think of something positive to do. But I think the anger is an unavoidable stage.
There must have been some concern early on, of sort of reopening the wounds in yourself. This is something I talk to musicians about a lot, is writing. You write a song about a certain point in your life, or, dealing with something, and then you go out on tour, and, 2-3 years later, or longer than that, if you have a good career, you're playing that song, and it, unavoidable that it sort of evokes that in you. And there's a difficulty here that I can't even imagine I don't know if subjecting is the right word, but, to knowing that there's a certain amount of your life that you're going to have to devote to working through this process and having it be the main thing that you think about all day. I can't imagine how at times painful the process of writing this book must have been.
It was very difficult in some spots, some harder than others. Some were pleasant, nostalgic images, horseback rides down pretty back lanes. There's some nostalgia, but there were some spots that were very difficult. I think it's like pulling a tooth, is sort of like pulling a tooth and taking a year to do it. So, but once the tooth out, it's out. That seems to be, I'd say, the most accurate is pulling a tooth for a year, but once it's gone, it's gone. And the book is in a way the tooth. So I've yanked it out. Here it is. I can talk about it, but now it's separated from me. I suppose I can be angry with whoever gave me the toothache in the first place, but I think after you've had your rotten tooth taken out, you don't agonize over it that much. You're just glad it's gone.